Before I begin on the actual study, we all need to get on the same page and understand why injuries are important and why they're such an issue. I like this graphic because it's a really easy visual way to understand why we care about this. Injuries are the leading cause of death for ages 1 to 44 years. So it's the leading cause of death for children as well as for many of the fathers that we're talking about today. It's an absolutely astoundingly huge issue. And the other thing that I should mention is that it's an even bigger cause of death for men and boys. Men and boys are more likely to be affected by injury than women and girls. So it's just something that we really need to pay attention to. And this is a slide I like to show policymakers because it gets their attention. How much does it cost for us not to do anything about this? $34.5 billion a year is what the cost is for injuries in Canada. So that's a number that's so large, so staggering that I don't get it. What is $34.5 billion? Well, that works out to over $65,000 per minute. So every minute that goes by, another $65,000 plus is spent on treating or dealing with injuries in some way. So you can see why it's such a focus for us. Now, this study in particular, why are we interested in this study? Well, we know from past research that actually parents have a very large impact on the injuries that their kids experience. So, for example, the type of supervision that they do, the safety practices that they put in place, their attitudes towards preventing injuries, whether they think it's actually important to do that. But especially this is the case for kids in the younger ages, the preschool and toddler ages. However, as we've been hearing before, most of the research is done on mothers. And so we actually know very little about what's going on for fathers around their attitudes and practices towards injuries and injury prevention. And to simplify this grossly, I realize this is a very gross simplification. Mothers and fathers have different roles in their kids' lives. So mothers traditionally are the ones providing the comfort and the security. You know, when the child's crying, they go straight to their mother. Whereas fathers are the ones that are saying, well, let's go, let's try this, let's experience something new, and taking their kids out to try new things and potentially do some risky activities. We have 3 research questions. I'm not going to read them because they're long and boring, but I am going to be focusing on the latter 2 to give you some idea of what our preliminary results are so far. We've interviewed fathers, but we're still in the thick of data analysis. Just to tell you a bit about the final sample, and this is my husband and daughter, so he can't sue me for using the picture. We actually ended up interviewing 32 fathers of children who were aged 2 to 7 years old, and predominantly they were in the Greater Vancouver area. They ranged in age from 23 to 52 years with a mean age of about 39 years. Now, most of the fathers lived with the mother of the child, the vast majority. Most of the fathers were born in Canada. That's not to say that they were all white or Caucasian, but they were predominantly Canadian. And most of the fathers were working, though we did have some stay-at-home dads, as well as, you know, with the effects of the current economy, we had some dads who had lost their jobs and were at home, maybe not by choice. Here's a graph. It's just a really easy visual representation of what our sample consisted of, how much money they were making. And so you can see that it is predominantly a higher income group, though half of our sample was making under $60,000 per year. In terms of education, certainly mostly university educated, but we did have some representation from the other groups as well. Mostly people with 2 children in the family, some with 3 and some with 1. In terms of the kids that were represented by these fathers, they actually were quite evenly split between boys and girls. And so I'm only including here the kids that were between the ages of 2 and 7 years old. And there were 7 boy-girl families with the kids in those ages, which we were particularly interested in looking at, gender socialization and so on, which I'm actually not going to talk about today, but you can certainly ask me about it later on or at the break. And we asked dads to try and remember how many medically attended injuries their kids had had over their lifespan, really. And sure, there's memory problems, but they did report to us that there were 22 injuries to a total of 16 children. So some of these kids had had multiple injuries where they'd had to go back to a doctor or a Mediclinic or the Emerge or whatever more than once. So getting right to the results. So this is looking at how do fathers consider the safety needs of their kids when they're trying to introduce them to new experiences that may be potentially risky. So I want to start with this quote, and I'm going to break this quote apart as we go on, because it's a short quote, but it has so much richness and wealth that I really want to show you how it illustrates the thought process that many of our fathers described for this. So the first part that I want to kind of break apart and analyze is the let them go. And what this father's trying to get at here is really wanting to let children be able to, if they're actually saying, you know, Dad, I really want to try that, or I think it'd be really neat to do this, to let them. If they want to really lead on that, then great, let them do that. So here's a father who is really grappling with, well, this is kind of a dangerous situation, but they're having so much fun that I just, you know what, I'm just going to let them do it. So the next part of it that I want to talk a bit more about is that the experience is greater than the risk of injury. And so the thought is here that these experiences, these potential for risk-taking experiences are actually important to children to help them have these new experiences and to expand their world so they're learning new things. Now back to the quote, the fact that by doing these things that they would learn something. And this was actually a really major theme that came out in our talks with these fathers. They felt that the risky experience would teach the kids something, as well as even the experience of injury itself would be a learning experience. And they talked about a lot of things the kids would potentially learn. That they would learn new skills on how to do certain things, whether it be ride a bike or play soccer or be able to try that new equipment at the playground, or whatever the case may be. That they would learn what to avoid and what was actually dangerous. So if they'd experienced a close call or even an injury on something, that they would say, okay, well, that's probably not a good thing to do next time. That they might learn the limits of the environment. So for example, climbing a tree and understanding which branches might take their weight and which might not. That they would learn about themselves, that self-confidence. If they were successful at doing something that was somewhat challenging, that they would actually gain the confidence to be able to go on and try something else. That they would learn about what kind of person they are, whether they're the kind of person who likes doing this or doesn't like doing it. And that they would learn what their own limits were. And I think this is a quote that really nicely illustrates that as well. I like the cautious gung-ho. It's kind of an interesting way to put it. This is such an important point, actually, that I've included another quote that illustrates it well. So the other thing that they would learn is what it feels like to actually experience an injury and why it's important to avoid it. The fact that actually it's not very fun. Pain is not a good thing. And here's a good quote. They would also learn about taking responsibility for their own safety. The fact that it's not just mom or dad or other people around who need to protect them from injuries, but that they actually have to take some of that responsibility on themselves. fathers talked about, having lots of goals for their kids and how they saw their role in their kids' lives. And this was one of them, just being able to teach them about negotiating the world in a safe way. I can tell you, without a doubt, more boys than girls were getting injured. And it depends on the kind of injury, but with some having a larger gradient difference between boys and girls than others. In fact, I can tell you that internationally, there's only one injury that girls get injured at more than boys, and that's burns. Can you guess why?
Cooking.
Bang on, it's cooking. Yeah, cooking, exactly. Other than that, boys and men, I tell you, you're in danger. Protect yourselves. So let's go to the next part of this quote, which is, keeping in mind that the fathers wanted to they wanted their kids to have new experiences. They wanted them to learn from these experiences. But all of this was kind of overshadowed by considerations of the potential severity of the injury that was at risk. So one of our fathers actually had a really nice term that he called the medical versus medicine cabinet injury. And I think that summed it up really nicely. So you can see his quote here. So a lot of the fathers talked about kind of where their limit was, and we, especially with our later sample, we kind of pushed it. Okay, so are you willing to accept this? Are you willing to accept that? And so on. Like, okay, what about this? Most fathers seem to draw the line at broken limbs. I'd actually be interested in mothers. We haven't asked mothers this question. Where are the mothers? But we did ask the fathers. We did ask the fathers what they thought their wife would think. And certainly most of the fathers, and we're still analyzing this data as well, most of the fathers felt their wives were more conservative in their kind of protection of their kids than they were. I have to mention also that there were fathers that were on extreme ends of the scale. There were some fathers that just no injury was acceptable, and others that thought, well, a broken limb, that's only a day in the emerge. I can handle that, It's okay. As long as they don't, die, we're okay. So, but they also realized that, why was it important to care about injury prevention? And a lot of them had kind of this catastrophizing, I think that's the wrong word, but they did realize that the potential, the worst case scenario was pretty awful, that their kids could have permanent long-term damage, or that they could actually end up dead. And they certainly wanted to avoid that. But they also talked about what could happen to the kids' morale and psychology if they did have a serious injury. For example, losing confidence in their abilities. So if they tried something and it hadn't worked, maybe they'd get afraid. Maybe they wouldn't try that again. Or maybe they wouldn't try other things again. So that was a big concern. That they would be traumatized in general, perhaps even post-traumatic stress disorder. And that they would feel let down by their dad. So their dad was there to protect them, and he hadn't done it. And so that was, an issue for them. And here's a good quote that illustrates that. So dads wanted their kids. They wanted their kids out there. They wanted their kids doing things. And they also talked a lot about what they tried to do to make sure that their kids could do things without getting hurt. And so they did things like controlling the environment, where they would either try and choose a safe environment, like not let their kids cycle in traffic, but maybe a bike path and so on. They talked about using safety equipment, for example, if something were to happen, to minimize the impact of that injury. So like bike helmets, car seats, and so on. They talked about using teaching as a strategy, telling their kids what was dangerous, what wasn't, what kind of rules there might be in certain situations, like holding hands in traffic and so on. And here's a quote actually that summarizes quite a few of those strategies. One thing that came up quite strongly in terms of their injury prevention strategies was supervision. And there seemed to be kind of three main kinds of supervision. The first was kind of passive supervision, and you can see this at the park. The kids out playing, the parents talking to each other on the sidelines or sitting on a park bench on their Blackberries or, you know, drinking their coffee, talking to each other and so on. It's kind of like being close by without actually interacting with the child. Active supervision was more of the being right next to the child as they're trying out the equipment or whatever the case may be. And then there was this really interesting kind of supervision, which was less supervised risk-taking. And what this was more like, let's allow him to take risks, but I'll be right there so that if he falls or if something happens, I'm right there to stop it from being something serious. And here's a quote that illustrates that. So we asked the dads, how do you access safety information? Where do you go? What do you do? And about halfway through, it actually occurred to us to ask, do you access safety information? And it was pretty obvious once we figured out that we should be asking that. And in fact, they said, no, we don't. Well, and then when we probed a bit further, it was, oh, yeah, I guess I've looked at car seat stuff. Yeah, I guess I talked to so-and-so about getting a bike helmet and so on, but it wasn't really a conscious, proactive, you know, go out there, look for things. But they did talk to us in terms of when they did access, as well as what if they thought they ever had to access, how they would do it. And the internet, not surprisingly, came up really important as a source of information. As well as media, TV, news, newspapers and radio, printed materials such as brochures and pamphlets, talking to people such as their wives, other parents, their parents, and so on. Talking to experts, you know, people in the store that sold safety seats, or people that were experts in skiing, or you know, whatever the topic may be. Also finding information in community centers and schools and daycares and those kinds of places. So these were really, there were others, but these were really the ones that came out as the most mentioned. Now, in terms of the internet, they did identify that there were various problems with the internet, things that didn't work. The fact that a lot of websites weren't user-friendly. It wasn't like you could just click through them and it would be really easy to find what you were looking for, that the information might be buried, particularly on government websites, which are infamously bad. Don't you agree? Yeah. Also, even conducting searches was a problem, that they may Google a term and get so much information back, and just figuring out what there was actually valuable to what they wanted. And the fact that there was a lack of central location for information, like a one-stop shop website. And in fact, there are central locations, and I'm going to give you one a little bit later on. But there wasn't the perception that there was a one-stop shop that they could go to for all of this information. Now, they did have some suggestions. We asked them, okay, well, what would you use if you could have it? Or what works or what doesn't work? Here's what they said. Where do they get, or where would they like to see the information? In stores, in doctors' offices, in hospitals, at community events, ads on a bus, places like that. What should the information look like, or how should it be presented? Very colorful, with visuals, no text or minimal text. We don't want to read anything. Perhaps a question and answer format, and also that it would be handy to have material that they could actually show directly to their kids and use as a teaching tool for their kids. In fact, one father talked about the necessity for something like this to be bathroom reading. If it takes him longer than it would take him to go to the bathroom to read it, he's not interested, doesn't want it.